I was carrying our children while you built a second life. I am leaving, and you will never find us.
Fola, please, let me explain.
He had done the math 3 times before he let himself believe it. 3 heartbeats on the screen at the 20-week scan, 3 names Fola had already picked without telling him which was which. And now, standing in a hallway of a house that had gone completely silent, Choi Woo-jin was doing math again, except this time it was the arithmetic of loss, and it would not resolve into anything he could manage. 6 days, she had been due in 6 days, and the house had emptied itself sometime between the previous morning and this one, and there was nothing in the arithmetic of that timeline that made any sense to a man who had believed, right up until the moment he opened the front door, that his wife was still in the 3rd-floor bedroom she had been confined to on bed rest, 3 lives moving inside her, waiting for him to come home from somewhere he should not have been. If you are watching this tonight, tell me where you are. Tell me what the weather is doing outside your window right now, because I think stories like this land differently depending on whether the night around you is quiet or loud. This is a story about a man who believed his power made him untouchable, and about the woman who proved, without raising her voice once, that untouchable and unaccountable were never the same thing. Stay with me, because I do not think you will guess where this one goes. Her name was Folasade Ademi. This is the story of how she went from a woman confined to a bed in a house she no longer trusted, carrying 3 children for a man who had already chosen someone else, to a woman standing on her own ground 18 months later with 3 healthy children and a name that no longer belonged to him. But to understand how she got there, you need to understand where she started. If this story has already caught something in you, subscribe now, because what Fola did in the 6 days before she disappeared is the part of this story people talk about long after it ends. Let me start from the beginning. Fola was 29 when she came to Incheon on a 2-year architecture contract, hired to consult on the interior design of a mixed-use tower her firm had partnered with a Korean development group to build. She had grown up in Lagos, watching her mother run a small furniture workshop out of the back of their house, and she had inherited from her a specific, stubborn belief that beautiful things were built, not given, that if you worked with your hands and your mind long enough, the world eventually made room for what you had made. She had never been a woman who waited for permission. She met Choi Woo-jin at a site walkthrough 8 months into the contract, when the development group's principal investor showed up unannounced to inspect progress on a project that, she would learn much later, quietly laundered a fraction of its financing through channels that had nothing to do with construction. She did not know that then. What she knew was that he asked her precise, informed questions about load-bearing decisions most investors never bothered to understand, and that when she corrected an assumption he'd made about a structural detail, he did not get defensive. He wrote it down. She found that more attractive than she expected to. For the first year, everything about him confirmed what she wanted to believe. He was attentive in ways that felt effortless rather than performed. He remembered which of her sketches she was proudest of. He showed up to a client presentation she was nervous about and said nothing the entire time, just sat in the back where she could see him, which she understood without needing it explained. She had never had a partner who made room for her ambition instead of competing with it, and she let herself believe, slowly and then completely, that she had found something rare. She did not yet understand what she had actually found, which was a man who had spent his entire adult life being told that appearances were a form of control, and who had learned to perform devotion with the same precision he applied to everything else in his professional life. She would not understand the difference between performed devotion and real devotion for 2 more years, and by the time she did, she would be 28 weeks pregnant with triplets, confined to a bed on doctor's orders, and entirely alone in a house that had once felt like the safest place she had ever lived. She found out about the other woman on a Tuesday from a nurse who mentioned, without any idea of what she was revealing, that Mr. Choi had called the practice the week before asking about a completely unrelated patient's appointment schedule, a woman named Han Yuri, whose file, it turned out, belonged to the same obstetric practice Fola used, 3 floors down, under a different doctor. Fola did not confront him. She did not cry where anyone could see her. She lay very still in the bed she had been ordered not to leave, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach, feeling 3 small movements answer her touch, and she made a decision with a stillness that would have frightened anyone who truly understood what that stillness meant. She had 6 days before her next scheduled appointment, and 6 days, she had already begun to understand, was more than enough time. To understand what Fola was capable of building in 6 days, you have to understand what she had already been quietly building for months before that Tuesday, because the disappearance did not begin with the nurse's comment. It began earlier, in ways even Fola had not fully named to herself until she needed them. Her closest friend in Incheon was a woman named Ngozi Balogun, a fellow Nigerian expatriate who ran a small logistics consultancy and who had met Fola at a diaspora networking dinner 2 years earlier, one of the only rooms in the city where Fola didn't have to explain herself twice. Ngozi had never trusted Woo Jin fully, not because of anything specific he did, but because of a pattern she had noticed early and never stopped noticing. He was a man who managed people. Not cruelly, not obviously, but constantly, the way some men manage weather, adjusting the temperature of a room before anyone else realized it needed adjusting. She had said to Fola once, over dinner in the second trimester, "Does he ever let you see him actually decide something, or does it just already look decided by the time you hear about it?" Fola had laughed it off. She had called it competence. Ngozi had not laughed back. Inside Woo Jin's world, there were 2 people who mattered most to how the coming months would unfold, though neither of them fully understood their own role in it yet. The first was Yoon Tae-sung, Woo Jin's head of security for 9 years, a man Fola had come to trust with the specific, unspoken trust reserved for people who are present for the boring, unglamorous parts of a life. He drove her to appointments when Woo Jin could not. He remembered, without being told twice, that she preferred the car 2 degrees warmer than Woo Jin did. He had watched her build a life inside an organization that was not hers, with a patience and grace that he privately respected more than he ever said aloud. What Fola did not know, could not have known, was that Tae-sung had been raised inside loyalty structures that taught him exactly one hierarchy of obligation, and that hierarchy had never, in 9 years, been tested against something that might require him to choose a side other than his employer's. The second was Choi Bo-ram, Woo Jin's mother, 63 years old, precise and unhurried, in a way that made most people underestimate how closely she was paying attention. Fola had met her formally 4 times across 2 years, at family obligations arranged with the particular carefulness of a woman evaluating something she had not yet decided to approve of. Bo-ram had never been unkind to Fola. She had also never once, in 2 years, said anything that could be interpreted as warmth. At the last of these dinners, 7 months pregnant and exhausted in a way that made her honest without meaning to be, Fola had asked Bo-ram directly whether she had ever imagined her son with someone who looked like Fola. Bo-ram had considered the question with a stillness that gave nothing away and said only, "I imagined my son with someone who would tell him the truth. I am still deciding whether that describes you or him." Fola had not understood the sentence fully at the time. She would think about it a great deal in the months that followed. The year the pregnancy was confirmed, the year everything Fola had built with Woo Jin should have felt most solid, was also the year she began noticing the small, specific absences that would later assemble themselves into a pattern too large to ignore. He missed the 12-week scan for a call he described as unmissable and never fully explained. He came home smelling faintly of a perfume that was not the brand he had once, early on, bought for her as a gift, a detail she noticed and set aside because setting things aside had become, without her fully realizing it, one of her most practiced skills. She had learned, the way people in proximity to men like Woo Jin learn, to read the specific weather of his moods, when a project had gone badly and needed 40 minutes of silence before conversation, when a phone call meant he would be gone until morning and asking why would only make the going harder. She told herself this was simply what partnership with a man carrying his particular weight required: patience, discretion. The quiet management of another person's temperature, which she had once, foolishly, mistaken for the architecture of a marriage. There were real moments inside all of this, moments she would not later be able to file away as entirely false, because dramatic irony works precisely this way, giving the audience information the protagonist does not yet have while still letting her live inside something that felt, from the inside, genuinely tender. The night he sat with her until 3 a.m. going over nursery paint samples because she could not sleep and did not want to be alone with the decision. The morning he found out about the triplets at the 16-week scan and went completely silent in the exam room, and when she looked at him, frightened by the silence, he was not blank, he was undone, in a way she had never seen him be undone by anything else in 2 years, and she had held on to that moment for months afterward as evidence that whatever else was true, this part had been real. It was these moments, real and warm and impossible to fully discount, that made what came next so devastating, because you, watching this story, already understand something Fola did not yet fully understand that Tuesday with the nurse. A man can be genuinely undone by the sight of his children on an ultrasound screen and still be capable, in the same season of his life, of choosing convenience and comfort in a hotel room across the city. These are not contradictions. They are simply 2 rooms in the same house, and Fola had only ever been shown the furnished one. There was a detail, small enough that she had filed it away as nothing 8 months earlier, that she would return to with total clarity once she understood what it meant. At a family dinner, Boram had asked her, in the careful English she reserved for questions she considered delicate, whether Fola had people in Nigeria, family, who could come stay with her once the Barbies arrived. Fola had answered honestly that her mother had offered, but that she and Woojin had discussed managing the first months themselves. Boram had nodded slowly and said only, "That is good. It is useful to know who would actually come if it were needed." Fola had thought at the time that this was simple maternal concern. She would understand, 8 months later, that it had been something closer to reconnaissance, and that Boram had been the only person in that house asking the questions that actually mattered. She did not confront him. That was the decision that had already been made by the time the nurse's comment finished landing, though it would take Fola the rest of that day to understand she had made it. She lay in the bed she was not supposed to leave, one hand on the curve of her stomach, and she listened to the specific quiet of a house that had, until that afternoon, felt like the safest place she had ever lived, and she understood that safety had been, for longer than she wanted to admit, a story she was telling herself rather than a fact. She waited until the following morning to look, because she needed to be certain before she let herself feel anything, and Fola had never once in her life acted on a feeling she had not first verified. She used his laptop while he was in the shower, a laptop he had never bothered to hide from her because he had never imagined a version of her that would look. It took 11 minutes to find what she needed. A calendar entry 3 weeks earlier labeled only with initials and a hotel address in Songdo. A text thread, brief and careless, the kind men leave behind when they have never once believed getting caught was a realistic outcome. Han Yuri, 29 years old, an event planner he had met, according to the thread, at a corporate function 11 months earlier, 4 months before Fola had confirmed she was carrying triplets. 11 months. She sat with that number the way you sit with a number that changes the shape of everything behind it. Not a single lapse in a difficult season. A parallel life, built and maintained with the same quiet competence he applied to everything else, running underneath the life she had believed was theirs for nearly a year. This was the moment, if the story asked her to, where she could have chosen confrontation, could have waited for him to come out of the shower and demanded he explain himself, could have called Boram, could have done any of the things a woman in her position might reasonably do. She understood, closing the laptop, exactly why she was not going to do any of them. Confrontation would give him something to manage. He was, she had learned over 2 years of watching him work, extraordinarily good at managing things once he knew they required managing. What he was not prepared for, what she did not think anyone in his life had ever once prepared him for, was silence that gave him nothing to respond to at all. She had 6 days until her next scan. She spent them building. She called her obstetrician first, not the practice Woojin knew, a different one entirely in Daejeon 2 hours away, a high-risk specialist she found through a colleague from her firm who had used the same doctor for her own complicated pregnancy the year before. She scheduled a consultation for the following week, using her maiden name for the intake, a small thing that felt doing it, less like deception and more like the first true thing she had done in months. She called Ngozi second and told her everything, and Ngozi did not ask her to reconsider, did not perform the shock the situation might have warranted. She asked one question: "Where do you actually want to be when this is over?" And Fola, hearing herself answer, understood that she had already known the answer for longer than she'd admitted. Somewhere he cannot simply arrive and rearrange things back to how he wants them to look. The ticking clock was not abstract. She was 28 weeks along with triplets, which her doctor had already told her meant delivery was likely somewhere between 34 and 36 weeks, not the 40 a singleton pregnancy might allow. Whatever she was going to build, she had to build it now, in a body that tired after 20 minutes of standing, with a due date that was not a distant hypothetical, but an approaching wall. She used money that was entirely her own, an account she had opened in her first year in Korea, before Woo Jin, funded by her architecture salary, and never once merged into anything he had access to, a decision she had made at the time for reasons that had nothing to do with foresight and everything to do with a simple, stubborn habit of never fully surrendering her own footing, no matter how safe a room felt. It was not a fortune. It was enough. Ngozi found the apartment, a two-bedroom in Daejeon near the new specialist, leased under Ngozi's logistics company rather than either of their names, arranged within 3 days through a landlord who did not ask questions because Ngozi's company had rented from him twice before. Ngozi drove the first boxes down herself on the 4th day, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon when Woo Jin was in meetings that ran, as they always did, past dinner. Every action created a small, compounding problem that Fola had to solve immediately behind it, the specific pressure of building an exit inside a house whose staff reported, in ways large and small, to a man who employed nearly everyone in it. She could not use the household car for the larger trips. She could not ask the housekeeper to help pack, could not explain the boxes if anyone noticed them before they were gone. She managed it the way she managed everything, in small, careful increments, spread across days, disguised as nothing in particular. A donation trip here, a box of maternity clothes she claimed she was giving to a colleague, nothing that, examined individually, meant anything at all. On the 5th night, 28 weeks and 4 days along, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the pregnancy and everything to do with the specific labor of dismantling a life in secret while pretending to still be living inside it, she stood in the nursery Woo Jin had commissioned, 3 cribs arranged along one wall, and she allowed herself, for the first time since the nurse's comment, to cry, not for long, 9 minutes, she would remember later, oddly precise about it, the way grief sometimes insists on being measured. And when it was over, she felt something she had not expected to feel yet. Not peace, clarity, the specific, cold understanding of a thing finally seen without its furniture. He had never fully chosen her. He had accommodated her, generously, attentively, in a way that had felt for 2 years indistinguishable from choice. There was a difference. She understood it now completely. On the 6th morning, 4 hours before dawn, with Yoon Tae-sung standing in the driveway because she had told him only that she needed to go to an early appointment and could not explain further, she looked at him and said the only thing she planned to say to anyone that morning. "Tell him I am not missing. Tell him I am not coming back. Tell him I am fine, and I will call him when there is something worth saying." She did not wait to see whether Tae-sung would follow the instruction or ignore it. She got into the car Ngozi had arranged, 3 car seats already installed and empty in the back, waiting, and she did not look back at the house as it receded. Woo Jin came home at 11 that night to a house that made no sound. He would tell himself, in the elevator, that he was imagining the wrongness of it, the same way he had told himself for months that the small absences accumulating in his life meant nothing in particular. He opened the door and stood very still, the way a body stills itself before the mind catches up to what it already knows, and he called her name into a silence that gave nothing back. The nursery was the 3rd room he checked. The 3 cribs were gone, not disassembled violently, not left in disarray, simply gone, taken with the same careful order Fola applied to everything she touched. The mobile she had hung herself over the center crib, small folded paper birds, because she said the store-bought ones felt too loud for a room meant for sleeping, was gone. The walls still held the pale gold she had spent 2 weekends choosing, holding swatches up at different hours to watch how the light changed them. The paint remained. Everything else did not. He found the note on the kitchen counter, not a letter, 4 sentences on a single card, and he would read those 4 sentences more times over the following weeks than he would ever admit to anyone. I know about Han Yuri. I have been carrying our children for 7 months while you built a second life around theirs. I'm not doing this out of anger. I am doing it because I refuse to raise them in a house where I have to compete for you. He called her number 11 times before midnight. It rang each time and went to voicemail, her recorded voice calm and slightly formal, the way it always sounded on messages, until the 12th call, which went straight through without ringing at all. She had turned the phone off. He called Taesung next, and the silence that answered his question, "Where is my wife?" told him most of what he needed to know before Taesung said a single word. "She left before dawn, boss. I drove her. She asked me not to follow further once she was in the car, and I didn't. And she said something before she got in. Tell him I'm not missing. Tell him I'm not coming back. Tell him I'm fine." Woojin sat with that sentence in the dark of the empty penthouse and understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that the woman who had just disappeared with his 3 unborn children had planned this with the same competence he had always privately admired in her, and that admiration and devastation, it turned out, could occupy the same body at the same time without cancelling each other out. He did not sleep. He sat at the kitchen counter until dawn, running through every conversation of the past year, trying to locate the exact moment when he had stopped being present in his own marriage, and finding, instead of one moment, 1,000 small absences that had accumulated so gradually he had never once registered the total weight of them. He thought of the 12-week scan he had missed for a call that had, in retrospect, not been unmissable at all. He thought of the perfume she must have noticed, must have filed away in that specific quiet way she had of noticing things and saying nothing, months before the nurse ever confirmed it for her. He called his lawyer, Park Do-hyun, at 7, and Do-hyun's first question, after confirming the facts, was the one Woojin had been dreading. "Is there anything she could use against you if this becomes a custody matter?" And Woojin thought of 11 months of hotel receipts and a second phone he had never once considered she might find, and said yes, and heard his lawyer's voice shift into something more careful in response. The pressure did not stay contained to the marriage. Within a week, 2 of Woojin's senior lieutenants noticed his attention had gone somewhere else entirely, and a rival syndicate leader named Baek Jong-soo, who had been quietly patient for 18 months waiting for exactly this kind of opening, moved on 3 of Woojin's supply contracts in a single coordinated night, using information that could only have come from inside the organization. Woojin absorbed the news standing at his office window with the specific numb recognition of a man discovering that his personal collapse had not stayed personal after all, that it had bled into every structure he had spent 15 years building, because a leader distracted by his own unraveling life was, to a patient enough rival, simply an opportunity. Meanwhile, Han Yuri called him on the 3rd day, her voice careful, probing for tone in a way that told him she had already heard something through channels neither of them controlled. When he finally told her plainly that Fola had left and taken the children, the silence on the line was not the silence of someone absorbing devastating news. It was the silence, he recognized even in his own exhaustion, of someone recalculating her position. "I need to see you," she said finally. "Not tonight," he told her, and hung up before she could argue, and sat with the specific vertigo of understanding that he now had 2 women independently reassessing what he was actually worth to them, and neither assessment was likely to favor him. His mother called on the 4th day, and her voice, when he answered, had none of the softness he might have hoped for, and all of the precision he had come to expect from her his entire life. "I heard," she said. "Taesung called me before he called anyone else because he didn't know what to do with the worry and needed somewhere to put it. Come to the house, not a driver, you." He drove himself through Incheon traffic with his hands doing something useful because his mind, left without an anchor, kept arriving at the same empty nursery over and over. Baram was waiting in the doorway when he arrived, and she looked at him with an expression that held none of the drama he had half prepared for, only a steady, clear-eyed recognition, as though she were looking at something she had long suspected would eventually arrive. "You look terrible," she said. "I know," he answered. "Come in." She had tea on the table, because she always did, as though she moved through life in a state of permanent readiness for the difficult conversations that kept finding their way to her door. "Say what you came to say," he told her, sitting down without touching the tea. "I didn't ask you here to say something to you," she said. "I asked you here to stop you sitting alone in that house pretending you don't already know the answer to the question you're too frightened to ask yourself. Do you know where she is?" A pause, small but exact. "No," Bahram said, "but if I did, I'm not certain I would tell you yet." And before he could respond to that, she added the sentence that would sit with him longer than almost anything else said that week. "I have known about Yuri for 4 months. I said nothing because I believed you would see what you were building before it cost you something you couldn't get back. I was wrong about your timeline. I was not wrong about the cost." He left Seongbuk-dong 2 hours later with nothing resolved and everything clarified, which was, he was beginning to understand, exactly how conversations with his mother always worked. His investigator, a former detective named Lim Tae-won, called that evening with the preliminary report. "She's still in the country, domestic movement only, no flights out of Incheon or Gimpo, no traceable use of any account connected to your household. Whatever money she's operating on, she set it up separately, and from what I can tell, she set it up months ago, not days." Woo Jin absorbed this standing in the empty kitchen, the specific weight of understanding that while she had been confined to bed on his household's terms, exhausted and monitored, and carrying 3 of his children, she had also, quietly and without a single visible seam, been building the entire infrastructure of a life without him. The call that changed the shape of everything came 4 days after his mother's warning, while Woo Jin was sitting in a rebuilding session with his 2 remaining trusted lieutenants, trying to map which of his supply routes Baek Jong-soo could still reach. Do Hyun's name lit up his phone, and something in the timing told him, before he answered, that this was not going to be about the syndicate. "We have a complication," Do Hyun said. "Han Yuri called my office an hour ago. She wants her own legal representation, not me. She made that clear before she said anything else." Woo Jin waited. "She's pregnant, 8 weeks, by her own account. She wanted me to know before you heard it any other way. She called it a professional courtesy." Woo Jin did not move for a full 10 seconds, the specific stillness of a man whose body was still deciding whether the ground beneath him was real. 8 weeks. He counted backward without wanting to, and arrived, inevitably, at a weekend in Songdo he had told Fola was a site inspection, 3 weeks before her 20-week scan, the appointment where they had learned together that she was carrying triplets. He had gone from that room, still holding the printed ultrasound image, directly to a hotel where another woman had, apparently, also been carrying something of his. "Has she made any demands?" he asked. "Not yet. She wants to talk to you first." Do Hyun paused. She didn't sound frightened. She sounded like she'd already thought it through completely. "That's worse," Woo Jin said, and Do Hyun agreed that it was. He called Yuri that night and heard, underneath her careful voice, the same recalculating quality Fola's silence had trained him to recognize instantly now, too late to be useful for anything but recognition. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't know about your wife," she said. "I've known the whole time, Woo Jin. I'm not performing surprise for you. What I need is to know whether I'm making decisions alone from here, or whether you're actually present for this one." He had no honest answer that would satisfy her, and he told her that plainly, and she gave him 1 week to find a better one, the same week his lawyer had already told him he did not have to spare. 2 hours later, Do Hyun called again, his voice carrying the specific measured weight of a man delivering news he had been dreading to deliver. "I've been mapping what happens if Fola files formally," he said, "and I need to tell you she's in a stronger position than either of us expected. She's filed a preliminary intake with family court, not a full petition yet, just groundwork. But the language in it, Woo Jin, it references documented financial evidence, hotel charges, a second account you didn't know she'd found, and a witness statement already on file from a nurse at her original practice, establishing a documented timeline for when the affair began relative to the pregnancy." "There's more," Do Hyun continued, and Woo Jin felt the specific dread of a man who had learned, over 3 exhausting weeks, to recognize that phrase as a warning. "Her intake lists intended legal representation. She's retained someone named Cho Min-ah. Do you know the name? Woo Jin did. Everyone in Inchen's business circles knew the name. Cho Min-ah did not simply practice family law. She had spent a decade building a reputation for dismantling powerful men who believed their resources made them untouchable, not through aggression, but through a specific, devastating precision, the patient assembly of documentation until there was nowhere left for the other side to stand. She had won 6 major cases in 5 years. In each of them, the men on the other side had arrived believing themselves safe. In each of them, they had been wrong. She's not treating this as a simple custody matter, Do Hyun said. She's building a reputational exposure case, and if it goes to discovery, everything comes with it. Everything, Woo Jin, not just the affair. Every financial structure your household touches that a forensic accountant would want to look at closely. Woo Jin sat with the full shape of it assembling itself in the silence after the call ended. A wife, 29 weeks pregnant with triplets, who had built a documented legal case in secret while confined to a bed he had monitored, while a household staff he employed reported to him on nearly everything except, it turned out, the one thing that mattered. A mistress, 8 weeks pregnant, independently retaining her own counsel and giving him a deadline he could not meet with anything but the truth. And beneath both of those catastrophes, a rival syndicate leader who had read his distraction as an opening and was, at this exact moment, still moving. He called Taesung to the penthouse that night and stood at the window with his back to the city while his head of security closed the door behind him. The hospital, he said, when Fola went in for the emergency consult in Daejeon 3 weeks before she left. You drove her there without telling me. Taesung did not answer immediately, which was itself an answer. She asked me not to, he said finally, and you didn't tell me anyway. Another pause shorter. I suspected what she was building, boss. I want to be honest with you about that. I didn't help her build it, but when she asked me not to say something, I didn't say it, and I think some part of me already understood why. Woo Jin looked at a man who had worked for him for 9 years, who had just admitted plainly to choosing silence over loyalty to him at the one moment loyalty might have mattered most, and felt 3 things arrive at once that he had no immediate way to sort. Fury, the old reflexive kind that had made men afraid of him for 15 years, something close to respect, uncomfortable and unwanted, and underneath both, a colder recognition that Taesung's silence had not been betrayal exactly. It had been the specific verdict of a man who had watched, over 9 years, exactly how present Woo Jin had actually been for the person he claimed to have built a life with. Why, he asked, and Taesung, for the first time in 9 years, let something shift in his face that was not quite apology and not quite defiance, only honesty. Because she was carrying 3 children alone through most of the difficult parts, and every time I drove her somewhere, she thanked me like I'd done something remarkable just by showing up. And I kept thinking, someone in her life should have made that feel ordinary to her instead of remarkable. I couldn't be that person. But I wasn't going to stop her from finding one. If you've ever discovered that everyone around you had already reached their own private verdict about who you'd become, long before you were willing to reach it yourself, I don't think I need to explain what that particular silence does to a man standing at a window with an entire city spread out beneath him, indifferent to every part of what he's just understood. And if you want to see what Fola built in the 2 months that follow, because what happens next is the part of this story that changes its entire direction, make sure you're subscribed, because I promise you will want to see where this goes. Woo Jin told Taesung to go home. He stood alone in the penthouse for a long time afterward, the ring he had bought Fola still sitting where he'd left it 3 weeks earlier, cold and untouched on the counter, and understood, with a clarity that had taken 3 separate catastrophes to produce, that finding her would not be the difficult part. The difficult part was that she had already reached a verdict about who he was, built an entire life around that verdict without asking his permission, and his finding her would not change a single sentence of it. It would only determine what came next. The 2 weeks that followed Do Hyun's warning were the worst of Woo Jin's life, and he understood, sitting through them, that they were entirely of his own making, which did not make them easier to survive. Baek Jong-soo moved again, this time on the organization's Songdo distribution hub, using an access window that could only have come from someone inside the operation who had watched Woo Jin's distraction closely enough to time it perfectly. The hub was not destroyed. It was transferred, quietly and completely, documentation rerouted to a shell company overnight. The kind of clean, patient theft that told Woo Jin his rival had been planning this for months, waiting for exactly the moment when Woo Jin's attention would be somewhere else entirely. Two of his most reliable contacts accepted better terms from Jong-soo within the same week, and Woo Jin, standing in his office reviewing the damage, understood that his personal collapse had become fully indistinguishable from his professional one, that both were bleeding from the same wound, and that the wound was him. He learned 3 days later that the person who had given Jong-soo the access window was a mid-level logistics coordinator named Ha Min-woo, 6 years inside the organization, a man Woo Jin had shaken hands with at exactly 2 company dinners and could not, if pressed honestly, have picked out of a room of strangers before that week. When Woo Jin sat across from him in a quiet room and asked why, Min-woo's answer landed with a specific, unwelcome familiarity. "You don't know who I am," he said. "You've never known who I am. I'm not a person to you, I'm a function. Everyone close to you is a person. The rest of us are inventory." Woo Jin removed him from the organization quietly, without public consequence, and sat afterward with the uncomfortable recognition that he had built an empire full of people he had never once actually seen, and that the not seeing had cost him in every direction at once. He did not sleep properly during any of this. He ate because his body demanded it, not because he wanted to. He lay awake most nights on the side of the bed that had never been his, because he could not stand the specific hollowness of the side that still held the faint impression of where Fola used to sleep, curled slightly toward the window because she said she liked to feel the light arrive before it actually did. He thought about her constantly now, not the version he had allowed himself to see for 2 years, generous and accommodating and endlessly patient, but the version underneath that one, the woman who had built an entire exit strategy from inside a body that could barely stand for 20 minutes at a time, and he understood, with a specific and humiliating clarity, that he had never once given her adequate credit for exactly how capable she was. Han Yuri's deadline arrived, and he had no better answer than the honest one he had given her the week before. He drove to her apartment in Mapo and told her plainly that he could not promise her the version of himself she needed yet, that he did not know if he was capable of becoming it, and that she deserved the truth instead of a performance he might not be able to sustain. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she said only that she needed time to think without him in the room, and he left without knowing whether she would keep the pregnancy or end it, whether she would ever call him again, and he drove home through streets that looked exactly as they always had and felt entirely unfamiliar. His investigator found Fola on a Thursday. She was in Daejeon, Lim Tae-won told him, a small apartment in a residential neighborhood registered under a logistics company, not her own name. She's 7 weeks from her due date now, high-risk monitoring, weekly appointments at a specialist practice. From what I can observe, she appears to be managing well given the circumstances. Woo Jin stood in his office holding the phone and felt the specific vertigo of learning that the woman he had lost was 7 weeks from delivering triplets alone in a city he had never once taken her to, doing better without him than he was doing without her. "Don't approach her," he said. "Don't let her know she's been found." "Understood," Lim said. "What do you want me to do?" Woo Jin thought of Do Hyun's 12 minutes of worst-case exposure, of Yuri's unanswered pregnancy, of his mother's voice at her kitchen table. The difficult part is that she has already reached a verdict, of Tae-sung standing in the penthouse admitting that his silence had been a verdict too. "Keep watching," he said finally, "but don't touch anything." He ended the call and stood at the window of an apartment that no longer felt like a home, in a city that continued its ordinary business 22 floors below, entirely indifferent to the specific architecture of everything he had lost. He understood, standing there, that he had reached the exact point where a man either became something fundamentally different than what he had been, or he did not, and that there was no version of the coming weeks that would let him remain the person who had once stood in an elevator, adjusting his tie, believing himself the kind of man nothing could ever truly cost. That man was gone. What replaced him had not yet fully arrived. And somewhere in Daejeon, in a small apartment with no marble floors and no evidence of an empire in any direction, Fola Ademi was 7 weeks from giving birth to 3 children who would, if nothing changed, grow up never once needing to know his name for anything except the one on a piece of paper. The message arrived on a Sunday morning, not from Fola, not from Do Hyun, but from a number Woo Jin didn't recognize with an Incheon area code. Mr. Choi, this is Choi Bo-ram's driver. Your mother asks that you come to Daejeon General Hospital immediately. She did not explain further. Woo Jin stood in his kitchen holding his phone and understood, before he had processed a single detail, that his mother had gone around him entirely, that she had found Fola before his own investigator had been permitted to move, and that whatever was happening now was happening on terms he had no part in setting. He drove the 2 hours without stopping and arrived to find his mother sitting alone in a hospital waiting area, small and composed in the specific way she always was, a folder resting closed on her lap. She's delivered, Bo-ram said before he could ask. Early but stable, all 3 of them stable. She looked at him with an expression that held no softness and no cruelty either, only the same clear-eyed assessment she had turned on him his whole life. She called me 4 days ago, Bo-ram said. Not you, me. She said she wanted her children to know their grandmother, whatever happened between the 2 of you, and she asked me to come when it was time, and to come alone. Woo Jin absorbed this, standing in a fluorescent hallway 2 hours from the city he had built his life in, and understood that his wife had chosen, from inside an exit she had built specifically to remove herself from him, to preserve exactly one thread back into his family, and that thread was not him. She wants to see you, Bo-ram said, not for the reasons you're hopping. She has terms. You should hear them before you walk in there and say something that makes this harder than it already is. He found Fola in a recovery room, exhausted in a way that had a physical weight to it, 3 bassinets arranged along the wall, and when she looked at him, there was none of the fear or fury he had half prepared himself for. There was only the same stillness he now recognized as the most dangerous thing about her, the stillness of a woman who had already finished deciding and was simply waiting to see what he would do with a decision that was no longer his to make. I'm not asking you to explain yourself, she said, before he had said a word. I already know what happened. I have documentation of what happened. What I need from you right now is very simple. You will not use anything you have, any resource, any leverage, any lawyer to fight me for primary custody. You will not try to remove them from my care. If you want a relationship with your children, it will happen on a documented schedule, supervised at first, expanded only as you demonstrate you can be trusted with more. And it will happen because you show up consistently, not because you decide, one day, that you want it to. He stood very still, the way he had stood in the empty penthouse 3 months earlier, understanding that his power, the specific currency that had made every other obstacle in his life movable, was entirely irrelevant in this room. There was no leverage he could apply. There was no angle. She had built something with no threads for him to pull, and the only choice actually available to him was the one his mother had already named for him without saying it directly: become something genuinely different, or remain what he had been and lose the rest of it too. I'm not going to fight you, he said finally. I want to accept those terms, not negotiate them. Something moved in Fola's face that was not forgiveness, not yet, but was not entirely guarded either, the specific recalibration of a woman who had prepared for a different answer and received something else. Bo-ram, standing in the doorway, said nothing, but Woo Jin felt her attention on him with the particular weight of someone measuring whether a promise made in a hospital room at 4 in the morning would still be true in 6 months. He asked to see them. Fola hesitated, then nodded once, and led him to the bassinets, and he looked down at 3 children who did not yet know a single thing about who he was, who would learn it slowly, through actions rather than declarations. If he was capable of becoming the version of himself that could make that true. He reached out and let one small hand close around his finger, the reflexive grip of the newly born, not recognition, not choice, only the response to something warm and near. If you have ever stood at the edge of a decision that would define which version of yourself you were going to become for the rest of your life, you already know that the moment rarely feels dramatic while you're inside it. It felt, for Woo Jin, standing over that bassinet with his daughter's fingers wrapped around his own, quiet, ordinary, and entirely, terrifyingly real. The public reckoning did not arrive the way Woo Jin might once have staged it, with confrontation and spectacle. It arrived quietly, 18 months later, at an event he did not orchestrate and barely survived attending, the Incheon Development Council's annual gala, the same room where 2 years earlier he had first watched Fola correct an investor's assumption about a structural detail and felt something in himself shift toward her for the first time. Fola had rebuilt entirely in the 18 months since Daejeon, and she arrived at the gala not as anyone's wife, but as the newly announced lead architect on a redevelopment project that had, in a detail neither of them had orchestrated, been awarded independently of any connection to Woo Jin's holdings, evaluated and selected on the merits of her portfolio alone. She had built it back from nothing, in a city that had briefly seemed, from the fluorescent hallway of a hospital, to have no room left for her at all. Woo Jin was there because the gala's board still included several of his organization's legitimate business contacts, and because Do Hyun had advised, correctly, that his continued public presence mattered to the stability he had spent a year and a half slowly rebuilding, the same stability that had nearly collapsed entirely under Baek Jong-soo's patient opportunism. He had rebuilt that too, methodically, personally, sitting across from contacts he had once sent representatives to instead, learning the specific discipline of showing up in his own life rather than delegating the uncomfortable parts of it. The room noticed Fola's arrival in the particular ripple that moves through a crowd recognizing someone whose absence had been assumed permanent. She wore the reputation she had built rather than any name attached to him, and she crossed the room toward the stage where the evening's award presentations were about to begin. 3 young children technically at home, with Ngozi that night but present, in the way children are always present in a parent's bearing, in the steadiness she carried. Bo-ram found Woo Jin near the back of the room before the program began and said only, "Don't make this about you tonight. Whatever she says up there, whatever it costs you to hear it, you will stand still and you will let it be true." He had learned, over 18 months of supervised visits and slowly expanded time, and one uncomfortable, necessary session after another with a therapist his mother had quietly recommended, to recognize when Bo-ram's instructions were not suggestions. When the council's chair invited Fola to the microphone to accept recognition for the redevelopment project, she did not simply thank her firm and step down. She spoke briefly about what it had taken to complete a portfolio while raising triplets alone, about the specific isolation of building a life in a country that had not made room for her easily, about the difference between being accommodated and being valued, a distinction she said she had spent 2 years failing to notice and 18 months learning to demand from everyone in her life, professionally and otherwise. She did not name him. She did not need to. Enough people in that room had watched the story unfold at enough of a distance to understand exactly whose absence she was describing without a single direct word. She stepped down to genuine, sustained applause, and Woo Jin, standing near the back beside his mother, understood that this was not the confrontation he had once, in his worst private moments, imagined bracing for. It was something quieter and more permanent, a public record, established entirely on Fola's own terms, of a woman who had built her worth back in full view of the same industry that had once known her only as an addition to his life. Afterward, in the reception that followed, she found him near the windows, not to reopen anything, but because their oldest daughter's school had sent a form that required both parents' signatures, and Fola, disciplined as always, preferred to handle logistics directly rather than through counsel when the matter was small enough not to require it. They stood together for the length of time it took to review the form, and it was, Woo Jin understood, the first entirely ordinary conversation they had had in 2 years, unremarkable in a way that felt, standing inside it, like its own kind of achievement. "You've kept every visit," she said, not quite a question, folding the signed form back into her bag. "Everyone," he said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not warmth exactly, but was not its opposite either, the particular neutral clarity of a woman who had done the careful work of separating what she owed him emotionally, which was nothing, from what was simply, factually true. "Good," she said, "keep going." Then she turned and rejoined the reception, and Woo Jin stood at the window a moment longer, watching the city continue its ordinary business below, entirely indifferent to the specific weight of what he had just been told, and understood that it was, in its plain and unadorned way, the only verdict that had ever actually mattered. 2 years after the gala, Woo Jin's life had a shape to it that would have been unrecognizable to the man who once straightened his tie in an elevator mirror, certain he had done nothing that could not be managed. He had sold the Incheon penthouse the year after the hospital, not for money. The organization had stabilized well past that need by then, but because every time he walked through its door, he was standing again in the hallway of a house gone silent, and he did not want daily access to that version of himself. He bought a smaller place near Fola's neighborhood in Daejeon instead, close enough that the children's transitions between homes did not require a 2-hour drive. A second and third and fourth bedroom, painted the pale gold Fola had once chosen for a nursery he never got to finish, because his daughters had told him, without knowing the history of the color, that they liked it best. He kept in therapy with the specialist his mother had recommended, not because it had become comfortable, it rarely was, but because the discomfort had become, over time, a kind of honest signal rather than a threat, evidence he was still doing the work rather than performing having finished it. When his therapist asked him, at the 2-year mark, what he understood now that he hadn't at the start, he had sat with the question and said that he'd believed the hardest thing would be losing what he'd built, the marriage, the organization's stability, the version of his life he'd once controlled completely. It hadn't been. The hardest thing had been learning to be seen accurately by people who had every reason to describe him honestly, and finding he could not argue with a single word of it, and having to keep showing up in front of them anyway. Han Yuri had kept the pregnancy, and their son Daniel was walking now, loud and curious and entirely unbothered by the complicated architecture of the family he'd been born into. Woo Jin kept every scheduled visit there too, and Yuri, who had never fully trusted him and told him plainly she wasn't sure she ever fully would, had softened by degrees into something that functioned, if not as forgiveness, then as a working piece neither of them needed to perform for anyone else's benefit. His triplets called him Appa now, had for over a year 3 distinct small people who had each, in their own register, decided what that word meant based entirely on what he had actually shown up to be, rather than any story he told them about it. He had learned their preferences the slow way, catching up on information he'd missed at the start, that his son disliked loud rooms and loved water running in a sink, that one daughter laughed rarely but completely, the same selective, unguarded laugh her mother had, that the other counted things obsessively, stairs and cars and the buttons on his coat, gathering the world into categories with the serious focus of someone doing important work. He saw Fola at drop-offs and school events, and the ordinary, unremarkable intersections of 2 people raising children together without raising a life together, and the specific vertigo of those early encounters. Watching a woman he had once nearly lost the ability to truly see had settled over time into something steadier. She had built her firm's Daejeon office into a genuine practice of her own by then, and she stood, at every encounter, like a woman who had stopped waiting for anyone's permission to occupy her own life fully, which she had, in fact, entirely done. He understood, 2 years out from a hallway that had taught him more about himself than 15 years of running an empire ever had, that there was no clean ledger where the damage he'd caused balanced against what he'd since built, no single gesture large enough to settle what he owed. What there was instead, and what he had learned, slowly and at real cost, to find sufficient, was the accumulation, visit by visit, year by year, of a man who kept showing up. Not because it earned back what was lost. It didn't, and he no longer pretended otherwise, but because the alternative was to calcify around the damage and remain, permanently, the man in the elevator, certain nothing could ever truly cost him anything. He was not that man anymore. He was still, most days, becoming whoever came after him, which was uncomfortable and correct, and the only version of the truth he had left to build his life around. If Fola and Woojin's story moved you tonight, tell me where you're watching from, and tell me which part of this you're still thinking about. If you believe, the way this story insists on believing, that the truth eventually finds daylight no matter how carefully someone tries to manage it, hit subscribe, because there are more stories like this one coming, and I don't think you'll want to miss where they go next.